My name is Beatriz Rocha. I am the Chief Regulatory Liaison Officer of Fortria, and I'm here with Teresa Black, who is a Senior Director of Regulatory Strategy in our Product Development Market Access Consulting Group, to talk to you about the very exciting topic of diverse action plans, what to know about FDA diverse action plans. So with not much long ado, we will proceed. And just to let you know, this is our disclaimer. These opinions are the following slides are those of the presenters, and the presentations are actually incomplete without the verbal commentary. So just to keep that in mind. But basically, this is how we will proceed today. We have a part one of the presentation that I will deliver. This will talk about the importance of patient diversity in clinical research, the legal framework, and the regulatory mandate in the US for the diverse action plans. What are the initiatives to tackle diversity outside of the US that are ongoing? And briefly, good practice solutions. This part will be followed by Q&A. So you can post your questions and I will address after the talk. Then we'll move into the second part where Teresa will present, and she will go through the FDA feedback on submitted diverse action plans to date that we've seen and the trends for success. This part will also be followed by Q&A. So let's get into the topics. It is well accepted that clinical trial participants need to be representative of the real world and diverse population that will receive the new medication. So ensuring diversity in clinical trials is critical for the development of safe and efficacious therapies. Even though this is not a new concept, discrepancies have been the norm all over, with a minimal participation of underrepresented populations across all therapeutic areas. But until very recently, there was no legal or regulatory mandate to include these populations in clinical trials. So diversity is a top priority, driven by both a collective commitment and regulatory mandates. There is scientific consensus that ethnicity can influence a drug's effect at specific dosages and dose regimens. And there is scientific consensus also that there is an impact of ethnic factors on a medicine's efficacy and safety. Environmental factors, cultural factors, genetic factors. Now, there is also global regulatory recognition that ethnicity sensitivity is globally recognized. We have ICH E5 guideline that has been published in 1998 that talks about the impact of ethnic factors on a medicine's efficacy and safety. And we do have clinical study populations to reflect racial and ethnicity of the target population in the real world. Many studies on that. So there is global regulatory recognition. And more recently, there have been selected regulatory initiatives. First in the US FDA putting together the guidance on diversity action plan, which will be the most focus of this talk today. But more recently, we do see efforts from the UK, MHRA, also the EU CTR new regulations have this aspect of diversity. And very more recently, WHO had put forward some guidances on including underrepresented populations in clinical trials. So if we take a look at the US regulatory landscape, even though the regulatory landscape in the US officially started in 2022 with the draft guidance on the diversity plans, I myself actually think that the concept of patient centricity that was introduced by the 21st Century Act of 2016 was what the first mandate that set the stage for that. So this timeline shows how the guidelines and the law evolved since 2022. So in December 2022, there was US legislation that passed that contained several provisions to promote diversity in clinical trials and to support FDA's evaluation of safety and efficacy, included requirements for FDA to finalize the guidance on clinical trial diversity action plans as well. After that, November 2023 is the main date here that FDA had a public workshop in which they solicit input on increasing enrollment of historically underrepresented populations. This was followed in January of this year with a draft guidance on collection of race and ethnicity data and clinical studies for FDA-regulated products. And in 2024, and in April of the same year, so a couple of months later, this draft guidance was actually expanded when a new one on collection of race and ethnicity data was extended to observational studies as well. So the January one was for products being developed by the agents, and the April one was for the observational studies as well. And this was followed finally in June of 2024 by the draft guidance on specifically on the diversity action plan to improve enrollment of participants from underrepresented populations in clinical studies. So what is the FDA current ask in relation to data pertaining to underrepresented populations? So again, since 2022, FDA is asking the sponsors to discuss their plans to ensure the diversity and inclusion of underrepresented populations in clinical trials will occur. With the publication of the June 24 draft guidance, there was specific instructions on how to develop these diversity action plans. Now, even though ongoing phase 3 studies and those starting in the next year probably have been grandfathered in, we are in this period where the sponsors have been actively preparing diversity plans and submitting to the FDA to gather the agency's feedback before this will be mandated, which will occur 180 days after the publication of the finalized guidance. So the draft guidance was published in June. There was a period of 90 days for comments. The comments were closed in September, public comments, and now probably there will be another period of 60 to 90 days for the FDA to finalize the guides. They can take longer, but the expectation is that this will occur probably earlier in first Q of 2025. So once this guidance is final, there'll be 180 days of after 180 days, in order to enroll phase 3 in the US, there will be the obligation from the sponsors to submit this diverse action plan. Now, I need to make a parenthesis here because you saw that all that is the frame for that is in the legislation of December 2022. So because this guidance is part of this legislation, the terminology and the requests of the guidance are not simply recommendations, but are a mandate. So what the guidance say, instead of you might do or you should do, is you must do it, basically, okay? So keep that in mind. Differs from usually the normal process, the normal guidelines, which are non-binding advice. This is a binding advice. So what is the diversity action plan? This plan pertains to all phase 3 or registration studies for drugs, biologics, medical device. So it applies to investigational drug, biologic device studies that will support a marketing application. that for drugs, they should be submitted to the IND no later than when the protocol is submitted to the FDA, the phase 3 protocol. It may be suggested to be submitted also during the end of phase 2 meeting or other pivotal studies. For the device, it should be included in an IDE application or an appropriate any pre-market notification, request for classification, or application for pre-market approval. The FDA may consider a diversity action plan for an indication covering multiple studies. It might be a possibility. And most important, this plan also applies to pediatric studies and rare disease. What is the content of the diversity action plan? Besides the title page with all the administrative stuff there, there's important to define the goals for enrollment. So the goals for enrollment will determine what are the goals disaggregated by race, ethnicity, sex, and age of the clinically relevant population. Now, these goals will be determined by the prevalence of the disease in the US. Now, the next section will go through the rationale for these goals. So why is that we have these goals? What was the methodology used to derive the target enrollment goals? It needs to describe how an individual clinical study will contribute to the overall enrollment goals for the clinical development program. Again, we'll go through the rationale, which should include the data and the information that describe potential for differential safety and effectiveness, the data regarding genetic differences in PK, PD, safety, or effectiveness, the relevance of other population level or individual characteristics, which are available data suggest that may impact on the clinical outcome. And it should also include citations for sources of data and information. So it is a complex section, and there's a lot of data that must go there. And in the stop, when they mentioned about how the specific study will contribute to the totality of the program, this also opens the door for the discussion about how a global study will fit into a diversity plan that actually is defined by the prevalence in the US. So during the period of comments of the guidance, there was a lot of comments about that. I expect that the final guidance will be more clear than the draft. In the draft guidance, the FDA pointed out that non-US patients, if in similar conditions or similar standard of care and conditions of the US population, these non-US patients, participants could contribute to the target goals defined by the US population. To be seen. And finally, the last section will be the measures to meet the enrollment goals. So once you have your goals, how you will look into that and track that throughout the study, how you will measure that, and how you will mitigate to mitigate to the fact that when this is not being measured. Please, if someone could mute yourself, just thank you. So how to track and how to mitigate in case you are falling behind your plan. These are basically the last what they are interested to see, how the sponsors plan for that. So this is the US. And as I mentioned before, there are some diversity initiatives outside the US that came recently. So recently, the MHRA announced their guidance on inclusion and diversity plan, which is somehow aligned with the FDA's, with the big difference that is not mandated. It is voluntary. So it is encouraged, the submission of the plan is encouraged, but not mandated. They are very much looking into all clinical trial phase. This would apply. Factors of interest are extended beyond race, ethnicity, sex, and age. And there's a failure to submit a plan will not result in a clinical trial application being rejected. So the health regulators in UK are currently gathering public opinion. They have published questions for sponsors to respond, and they will run a pilot when the industry can submit protocols for review by the ethics committee. Yes. Now, also recently, WHO has published a guidance for several special populations. People with disability, pregnant and postpartum women, key populations, HIV, viral hepatitis, and sexually transmitted disease. So it's a more broader guidance in terms of touching all underrepresented populations. And for the clinical trials regulation that took effect on 31st January 2022, there's a specific section saying, unless otherwise justified in the protocol, the subject participating in the clinical trial should represent the population groups, for example, gender and age groups that are likely to use the medicinal product investigated in the clinical trial. So basically, they are all aligned to respond to the need and absolutely importance of having the participants in the clinical trial being representative of the real world population. Now, what are the good practice solutions for diversity in clinical trials? We see that as a 5-step or 5 buckets solution, right? So the first one is to really use real world data to inform the diversity planning. Through the epidemiology assessment, one will understand the prevalence of the disease in the US and will plan to set realistic diversity goals. This is the first step. The second bucket will be the diverse action plan writing, actually, right? To write all this is a regulatory document and needs to be written with the care and quality of a regulatory document. The third piece will be the implementation of this diverse action plan. So you have to leverage various solutions, identify diverse patients, how to implement, where they are, how to enroll these patients, how to maintain their enrollment, keep them in the studies, and really attracting and retaining as the main bucket here. Number 4, in-study monitoring. Once you identify where your patients are, you attract them, you retain them. How can you monitor the enrollment and monitor how this enrollment is in relation to the goals throughout the study? So this is tracking of key metrics throughout the trial. And finally, there will be a report, collation, and submission to the agency. There will be compilation of the data and preparation reports for submission to regulators. So this is really a good practice solution for diversity in clinical trials. And I will stop here and open for questions and Q&A sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beatrice. And we're starting to receive some questions via the chat feature, so I'll get us started. The first question that came through was, let's see here. Is FDA's expectation that the plan will be a topic discussed at the end of phase 2 meeting?
Well, I think Teresa will provide some feedback on that. I think it might, right? We've seen some signals of that. But anyhow, even if they are not expecting that, I think the end of phase 2 is a very important and clear opportunity to discuss that with the agency, right? So I think it's
Yes.
very appropriate to include that in the end of phase 2 meeting.
Perfect, thanks. A follow-up question from the same participant. Assume that sponsors have to provide updates to FDA. And the question is it with the IND annual report?
I would say that the IND annual report, if you are providing data on the study, you might want to include that. But this would be my take. It's not mandated, but I would include, if you are running a study aligned with the diversity action plan, I would think that this will be part of the reporting.
Beatrice, I think I
this,
want to expand on that. Yeah, I want
yeah,
to expand on that a little bit too, because I think a lot of sponsors opt into submitting a DSUR in lieu of an annual report. So for some sponsors, it might require additional dialogue to decide how to best report that data to FDA specific to a diversity action plan and your current metrics and enrollment status.
yeah.
Okay. An additional question. The EU CTR notably does not list race and ethnicity as an example of patient characteristics, and several EU countries do not allow collecting ethnicity characteristics in clinical trials.
Correct.
Or only if justified. Is there a general best approach to handle this, or is it case by case?
I think it's a case by case. When you have your global study, you will get what you can from countries where this is allowed or not, right? There is no, of course, the FDA has no jurisdiction to force on any of that. And it will be, I see this coming as in a global study, you will include the data from the countries where you were allowed to collect the data. And that's it. I don't think that there is any other. If this will move in a different direction, it will take time, I think.
Okay. Another question. What will happen if a diversity plan is not submitted together with the phase 3 protocol?
Well, I think according to the law, you will not be able to enroll your phase 3. So the phase 3 enrollment, so to start a phase 3 is contingent of the submission of the diversity action plan.
All right. For FDA regulated products, is the expectation is to recruit patient population from within the US? Let me try that again. For FDA regulated products, is the expectation to recruit patient population within US from underrepresented groups for regulatory approval?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Well, the expectation will
Okay.
be to the goals of recruitment will be defined by the prevalence of the disease in the US. So the prevalence will indicate what are the underrepresented groups to be included in the trial. Did I answer the question?
I'll watch for a follow-up on that one, Beatrice, from our participant. In the meanwhile, I have another question. In the future, do you know if a diversity plan will be needed for a pediatric study and it as a post-marketing commitment?
So right now, the focus is on phase 3 studies or studies that will support the registration, and these are applicable to pediatric indications. Now, I think we've seen some hints of post-marketing requirements when I think there is a possibility that if the agency doesn't think that, so for example, a study that had been conducted before the mandate come into place, right? it might be, we cannot discard the possibility that when the agency will review that, they will think that they are too much off of the diversity of the disease, and they might request a post-marketing study. We cannot discard that, but I think that this will come. Everyone will learn as this is being implemented, but I think we cannot discard the possibility that they will ask for a more diverse study in the post-marketing space.
All right. Can you please explain more how and when the data from diversity action plans should be included? Is this a separate report?
Is a separate what?
Is it a separate report?
I think so. I think there'll be a report on the diversity action plan, as I show in the fifth bullet here. Yeah, it'll be a separate thing. It'll be part of course, of the study report, but I think you will have at the end to say, okay, this was my goal, and this is how I achieved or not my goal, and you may need to explain in the final report. Yes.
Okay, and I've seen another question come through. I think you said that commencement of enrollment is contingent on the submission of the diversity plan. If so, can you comment on managing the review of the plan by FDA and managing the enrollment? How to best manage these parallel activities?
So before the draft guidance of June of this year, we were under the impression that once you would submit the plan, the FDA will come back with their comments. But this was actually spelled out very clearly in the draft guidance of June, saying that they would not come back with comments. So this is, again, one thing that, because of that, I think it's valuable to think about discussing your plans at the end of phase 2 meeting. Because once you submit, they may not come. They say they may not come with any comment. So I think it's very valuable to think about discussing that beforehand with the agency. And the end of phase 2 meeting is the right opportunity for that.
Okay, I've had another one come in, Beatrice. What would happen if a sponsor failed to meet the targets of their diversity action plan because recruiting in a subgroup of patients is more difficult than in others? Would they be forced to extend recruitment?
So I think that this will be a case-by-case discussion, right? Again, in the plan, if you remember, one of the sections is to say how you expect to reach the plan and what are the mitigations you will put in place, you will have in place to reach the plan. But of course, if this is impossible to go, I think there will be in the report the opportunity to explain why was this not possible to achieve, and also the opportunity to rationalize, saying that the lack of inclusion of this specific population is not necessarily implicate or impacting the overall result of the study. So I think there will be the possibility in the report to make this rationale, not only in the report, but in the entire application, right? In the dossier overall, saying, look, this is not what we didn't reach the goal, but we think that this, because of that, and that, we think that this may not have did not impact the final result because of this rationale. And also you will have the opportunity to say, look, we did not meet the goal in the phase 3 study, but look at the entirety of our program. Well, if you look at the entire population that participated in this program for phase 1 to phase 3, you might see a different vision of the overall population that participated there. So even though the FDA doesn't say that very clearly. I think they are very open to look into a programmatic representation instead of only the phase 3. The plan pertains to the phase 3 protocol, but they are going to look into the overall program as well.
And Beatrice, that's a
And
nice
to be-
tie into another. Oh, go
Yeah.
ahead, please.
No, I say if you want to complement something, go ahead, or you can just move to your, yeah.
No, actually, we've got 2 more questions. I think we've got time
Okay.
for 2 more, and then we'll probably transition into the next section. And actually, your last point is echoing. I see a lot of comments coming in. What if you aren't able to recruit in alignment with your proposed enrollment goals? How will that be handled? I think you've done a nice job of highlighting. It's probably going to be on a case-by-case basis. I think what will really be important, and this is where I think you find that a diversity action plan is really a multidisciplinary document. And you are at some juncture going to need some input from your from folks that are championing operational specific activities related to site pieces. Where are the sites located? Who are the investigators? Because obviously, I think one of the pieces you're going to need to highlight to FDA if you're unable to achieve your enrollment goals is being able to show that you did make efforts. And that can take various forms. From an operational point of view, and there could probably be a whole different webinar just dedicated to that element of things. But I think it'll be really important for sponsors to be able to document what they tried to do, all of the different things they tried to do, and if possible, be able to show over time if that mitigation or strategy that was put in place made a difference. So I think that's something else that's important to highlight as well. One last question, Beatrice. If you don't have an end of phase 2 meeting planned, if the strategy is to move directly into phase 3 confirmatory trial, when should you engage with the FDA? Can it be part of a type C meeting?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. And of course, if you are planning to move directly into phase 3, you probably have already discussed your plans beforehand, right? Either in a pre-IND meeting or whatever interaction you had before. So at the earliest possible time frame that you talk to the agency, you should also present your diversity approach, right? Your diversity action plan. But if you have not done that before and you have agreement of the agency to move directly into, you have a seamless phase 3 starting, you can definitely request a type C. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And Beatrice, depending on if there are other topics to be considered, it's possible FDA might think about a type D as well. If the diversity
type
plan
D,
was
yes.
the only
Yeah,
topic
absolutely.
of interest. Yeah.
Yeah.
A
Now
type D might be applicable as well.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Last question, and then I am going to cut it off, I think, is will FDA make the diversity plans public?
Well, they actually they mentioned that in the guidance. They will not be the ones making it public, but I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, they are suggesting the sponsors to make it public.
That is correct. They are encouraging sponsors to make information in terms of how they intend to approach diversity in their trial and then the subsequent success or status of that diversity. They are asking for sponsors to consider posting that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So now I will pass on to Teresa.
Perfect. Thank you, Beatrice. And I see some additional questions coming through. So what we'll do is we will round back with some of those at the end. We'll do the Q&A attached to part 2 of today's presentation. And then if we have time, we'll round back with some of those additional questions that I see coming through. So Beatrice, you can go ahead and advance the slides. That would be great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Excellent. So what I wanted to focus on here today is give you a little bit of background, give you some visibility into what we've seen to date from FDA when it comes to feedback received on submitted diversity action plans. What's probably important to note is that Fortrea has championed more than 45 diversity action plans since July of 2023, and we've been partnering with both large and small sized sponsor organizations to proactively address this codified requirement and articulate goals for increasing enrollment from historically underrepresented populations in clinical trials. And my one caveat to the information that's presented here on the slides is that this feedback is that which was received prior to FDA's revised guidance, which of course Beatrice highlighted earlier, was received in late June of this year. So I'll tackle these a little bit one by one, just to give you a flavor for what we had seen. So in some of our sponsor engagements, we had noticed there was some reluctancy to really formalize or put down on paper what an enrollment goal would look like. And so as you can see, one of the pieces of feedback that was received was that FDA came right out and indicated that you needed to outline the enrollment goals specific to underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. And of course, that would be based on what information is currently available, whether that's prevalence or incidence, because obviously prevalence is not available for all disease states. So it could be based on incidence. For some disease states, mortality can also be important to consider. So definitely ensuring that sponsors are indeed giving enrollment goals and not hesitating to do so. The other piece that came out too, and of course this is reflective of what we had for the 2022 guidance, is that enrollment goals should include two categories for ethnicity, and that was Hispanic and Latino and not Hispanic and Latino. And that's closely tied there to the third bullet, that there should be a minimum of 5 categories for race. Of course, they gave some specifics on what they would like to see, what was mandatory, and then what was nice to have. Of course, as we know, in the updated 2024 guidance, FDA specifically references other published guidances that they have with regards to race and ethnicity, as well as sex, age. So make sure to pay attention to those, because I think that's important in terms of how you present the specific target enrollment goals. And this, the next bullet here came up, I think, in our last presentation, and we definitely saw it echoed in the questions. FDA was certainly encouraging the collection of race and ethnicity data across global sites. And of course, there's recognition that how race and ethnicity might be recognized outside of the US does not perfectly overlap or align with what was just suggested above. But certainly it does provide an additional subset of data to be able to analyze and look at your diversity from start to finish in your trial. And that's closely tied into the second to last bullet point there on the slide. FDA has noted that they would consider the representation of the whole study population and the totality of data presented when they're assessing the applicability to the US patient population. So what will be very important to do is make sure that although your enrollment goals are informed by US specific data, you'll want to make sure you have your US information, but it will also be important to know what your diversity metrics are from a global perspective in terms of what you're actually achieving at the trial level. And a specific point here that I think really was expanded in the 24 guidance relative to the 2022 guidance was that encouragement to expand for other underrepresented populations. So outside of race and ethnicity, things like sex, age, gender, etc. And we definitely saw that shift from the 22 guidance to the 24 guidance in terms of the very specific demographic variables that FDA was looking for. So just as a recap there, again, some feedback we received prior to the 2024 guidance, and different pieces of information FDA was sharing across different divisions. So on the next slide there, what I want to do is chat a little bit about how to set success for any diversity action plans that you're working on with your clients or sponsors. And I think one of the big takeaways from FDA feedback to date is that diversity action plans should not be submitted without enrollment goals and the associated supportive rationale. And in alignment with the 2024 guidance, you want to make sure that the enrollment goals are disaggregated by race, ethnicity, sex, and age group at a minimum. There, of course, may be other demographic variables of interest for your specific population that you may wish to consider from a diversity perspective, but at a minimum, you should definitely have those 4 categories. Something we've really, I think, touched on multiple times in the presentation today is that you must submit a diversity action plan. But something that I think is important and perhaps not well understood is that that submission of a diversity action plan is required, even in instances when your US sites are targeted to open after sites outside of the US. So we had seen that from a few sponsors as well, sort of trying to figure out if they could not submit a diversity action plan or could they delay submitting a diversity action plan. And I think the revised guidance is very clear on this topic, when to submit and then how to submit accordingly. The other thing that has come up as some recent examples that I think is of interest, and Beatrice alluded to this earlier in the presentation, we've had instances where FDA has requested a diversity action plan, even in the absence of the final published guidance. So I've put 2 examples up there for us to consider. We've seen FDA specifically ask for a diversity action plan to be included as part of an end of phase 2 meeting package. We also have experience with a sponsor who submitted a special protocol assessment, and during the review period, FDA came back with a request for information that included the ask for a diversity action plan to be submitted. And so I think that that's really, really important. And I think that is tied to this concept of be prepared and plan early. Make sure that if you're working with a sponsor or a client, they understand that building and developing and writing a diversity action plan does not happen overnight. It takes input and expertise from multiple stakeholders to make the document come together and align with what FDA has put forth in their guidance. And you do not want to wait until the last minute to prepare it, especially if in the instance FDA does ask to see it at an earlier time point than you envisioned. One of the big takeaways from the guidance was around page count. And for sponsors that had already been working on diversity action plans across the last 2 years, this one has been a big one. I would say many of the plans that Fortrea has tackled were upwards of 30 or 40 pages in length. And so you can imagine that 10-page count is sticking out in their heads. But FDA was very specific. They really did want to see diversity action plans be more succinct. And I think that's a reflection of, many of you may have seen the publication that came out of the Center of Excellence in Oncology. And they did an analysis of diversity action plans from 2022 to 2023. And I suspect that part of the reason FDA put a page limit around diversity action plans was due to the fact that they realized, given what sponsors were submitting to date, they would never be able to make their way through all of the plans and review them in the robust fashion that we're used to FDA providing feedback on. So I think that's really where we see that 10-page count. I will say from personal experience, it is a bit of an uphill challenge to get everything into those 10 pages. And depending on the information you've used, your methodology, and how you're setting your enrollment goals, you may find that you are extending a little bit out of that 10 pages. I do not have current feedback to share with this group at this time in terms of if we've seen pushback from FDA on that. But I do think trying to stick right around that 10 pages will definitely be important. We also know that feedback, whether it's on an initial or revised diversity action plan, is no longer a guarantee. And so sponsors, if you have specific questions about a diversity action plan or a specific subgroup within a population that's of interest, the guidance is very clear, and there's a recommendation that sponsors should be seeking at that particular question or series of questions as a topic for an upcoming meeting with FDA. Of course, if you're following the traditional pathway, you most likely have an end of phase 2 meeting. That would be a great time to propose it. As we also highlighted, for programs that maybe are not going to proceed via an end of phase 2 meeting, you likely have an option for a type C or a type D meeting, depending on what other topics you may have to discuss with FDA. And finally, something we've highlighted a few times is really making sure that when you're working with their sponsor, they have the ability to monitor enrollment goals, both in the US as well as from a global perspective. Since we know that FDA is willing to consider the totality of diversity across the study, it can be helpful to understand what contributions are coming specific from the US, and then how can you leverage data outside of the US to make up any potential differences. I would also say that information in a real-time fashion about your enrollment goals can also help you determine the impact of your diversity action plan. Are there additional mitigations or strategies that need to be considered that weren't highlighted in your initial draft of a diversity action plan? And then I think in terms of that, once your trial is completed and you're putting together all of the reporting aspects, having access to that type of information as it trended over time will be really, really important for a sponsor. So I'm going to pause there for a moment, and I'm going to encourage our attendees today to continue to ask questions in the chat feature. And I've seen a couple come through. And Beatrice, I'll have you tag in as well, because I think these might be a little mixed in between both yours and mine, so we can
Sure.
we'll support one another. Let's see. How might the FDA use information in a diversity plan? Oh, that's a good question. I think in totality, we know that the underrepresented populations have historically been not as encouraged in clinical research for a variety of different reasons. And we could probably focus a whole webinar for those reasons themselves. I think at the end of the day, what's really important is FDA wants to make sure that the totality of evidence that's been gathered is generalizable to the group of patients that's going to be using that product upon approval. And I think to date, there's been lacking data for some of those subsets in which we would actually expect that patient population to be using the drug post-approval. So in my opinion, they're really looking to bolster evidence from both safety, efficacy, and effectiveness. Beatrice, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts.
No, I just think that as this progresses and more data are collected and presented, I think we'll see like the very first product that will be approved and had a diverse action plan submitted, we'll probably see that reflected and spelled out in the review from the agency. So it will be a very interesting field to continue follow up, because the data will be there, and it's just a matter of reading it and seeing how they are considering all that. And of course, if there is decisions, public decisions in terms of post-marketing studies and all that, we'll see that. So the precedents need to be there for us to start forming an opinion and seeing the trends there.
Sure. So this one's more directed at my piece. Earlier, I mentioned that FDA will not provide comments on diversity action plans. And the question is, when were these comments that I presented provided by FDA, and was this during an FDA meeting? So the comments that I presented on the first slide were received prior to June 24. So prior to publication of the revised guidance that we currently have. And in this instance, yes, a lot of those comments were provided during meetings that the sponsors had already pre-scheduled with FDA. So they did come in via agency feedback. And I think I just want to elaborate on this a little bit further. It's not that FDA will not provide comments across the board. They just are going to do it at their discretion. And we don't know what that will look like right now. It will likely be program specific. And we'll have to get a little further into this when sponsors are continuing to work through submission of plans reflecting the 24 guidance. So just keep in mind, you might receive comments, you might not receive comments. Again, probably program specific. Another question that's come through, what is the general response of the underrepresented groups to the diversity plan? And I'm thinking that's probably centered on if the diversity action plans have been shared with perhaps patient advocacy groups or other types of teams for review. I'm making that assumption. If I'm incorrect, please feel free to correct me in the comments. I will say that some sponsors are working with patient advocacy teams, and we are seeing more increased presence and an ask for them to participate in building the diversity action plans. I think obviously when you're talking about the strategies and the potential mitigations on how to ensure that you are recruiting and retaining these populations, that's a great place for those particular group of experts to give feedback. So I definitely think not every sponsor will be working with a patient advocacy group. And if the CRO is running the study, it's possible they are recommending one. But I do definitely think that's a group of experts that can be contributing to the strategy and mitigation piece. Okay. And I've seen a pause in the questions, and I am conscious we have about 3 minutes left. We could probably take 1 or 2 more questions if there were any more today. I'll just wait just a moment or two here. Okay. If a diversity plan is submitted with the protocol and the FDA does not provide comments to this separately, can the sponsor assume that enrollment can be initiated?
I think yes, because you fulfilled the legal requirement of submitting the plan.
I would agree. And we don't have anything to suggest otherwise for the moment. So I would agree with that as well, Beatrice.
We can talk in a year.
We might have to schedule a follow-up webinar to tackle that. Okay, probably have time for 1 more question. We'll provide a minute for folks to type.
Well, we are right on time. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you,
Excellent.
Teresa. Thank you for you guys who called in this morning. Thank you, Topra, for organizing that.